In this session, we're diving into an important topic of Indigenous representation in tech. Today in BC, Indigenous people hold less than 1% of the tech jobs in the province, despite making up 6% of BC's overall population. During today's event, we'll hear from a panel of Indigenous tech leaders who will share their perspectives on Indigenous representation in tech, discuss what barriers or challenges exist, and reflect on strategies that can create positive impact for the future.
Thank you, Erica. So Tansei Tuau, Nimiweta Newa Pamitan, as you heard, Andrea Reimer, Nitsi Kathan, Nigawe Nehia, Ekwa Kanai, Ekwa Métis, Jackfish Lake, Nikutwasik, Tipihamatowaski, Maka Miigwech, East Vancouver, Niwikin, Kinananaskomatin, Homoskium, Squahomish, Ekwa Slay, Watuth, Meho, Kakiao, Niwa, Gomaganak, Hai. All right, so all those Indigenous language classes in my language, which is Cree, are paying off a bit, but I think it's always a good day for us to make the languages of the Indigenous peoples of the land visible. And in the cases where those of us who have those languages to try and speak them out loud where we can. So I'm really pleased to be joining you all today. And I am really excited to be hosting this panel with Josh and Matthew and Darian. You heard a bit about them, but I would love for you to hear a bit more about them. So we're going to do a little bit of a get to know them session, starting with Josh. Josh, I did a bit of reading up on you. It sounds like we have at least one thing in common, and that is that neither one of us went to university, and yet here we are. You're the CEO of a gaming company. I'm a former city councilor, so I'd love to hear about your journey. How did you end up where you are?
Tanchi, everyone. I'm Josh. I'm from a real small town called Willow River, BC. Sometimes I do talks around the world and I say Willow River and somebody will cheer, and I'll be really happy because most people do not know where it's from. I used to think it was 200 people, and I went back home and my mom was like, "Are you crazy? There's probably like 120 at the top." So it was there used to be a big mining town called Giscombe, BC. It's right outside of Prince George, so northern BC. I grew up there, and that's one of the conversations that's ongoing, and one of the topics we keep talking about, that I keep talking about with government and in industry, and also to people that are going to school, to talk about. When you grow up in the north, university is pretty much not going to happen. It's for the select few, and I think how we're raised and how I was raised as being Métis, and just put your heads down and just work and don't cause any trouble and do a good job and everything will be good, is probably you're not going to go to university. So I really think what changed though is working for years in hospitality, and then one time seeing a brochure saying the internet information technology is the way of the future, and reading a pamphlet and say, should I do this? And then I ended up going to Capilano College and getting a 2-year program that was 1 year for adult students, and learned how to be a web developer. And now it's actually Capilano University, so I can proudly tell my mom that I went to university. So there you go, I ticked that box off. But yeah, trade school. And I think that's kind of the theme of today that I'll be continuing to talk about, is we have to kind of use the language of trade school and ticketing and versus university education.
Excellent. Thank you, Josh. So we're going to go to Matthew. Matthew, you were nodding vigorously at parts of that. So I'm guessing we all have some intersections in our stories, but I'd love to hear how you got to be the CEO of iComply. And I'm also interested in how you came to be an author, like what the jump was there for you and why that seemed important. I'm sure you're very busy as a CEO, so interested why you put time into that as well.
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess from my background, also further east, but also the cold white north of Manitoba. So that's where I moved here from. I've been here about 10 years, and actually similar to Josh, conversations around university and things like that, it was very unattainable at some point, especially early on. It was kind of like, okay, you go and you get a job, find something that you can maybe get trained up in, and the conversation about ticketing, maybe you get your forklift, maybe you get whatever, and that's kind of where education, the ceiling was. It was part of my move out here, actually, was to really, I found that even in the industry that I was working in, I was very much hitting a ceiling and was in kind of a box. This is the work that you do. And I really wanted to actually move more into technology. So I came to BC after the course of several years. I actually, through a lot of self-learning and working with other people, was able to, develop some skills in technology, and eventually actually applied to a program at MIT, and have done a couple of post university, not like full university degrees, but kind of post degree programs. And it kind of, opened up my eyes a lot to, I would say, frankly, some of my own imposter syndrome, and just not, like, oh, this is as far as I can go. And then all of a sudden being in a new room with people that, held titles and executives and letters behind their name, and realizing that actually, when the nuts and bolts came down to this specific topic, I actually understand it really well. And this whole idea of technology not being as scary as it needs to be. You don't need to be a nuclear scientist to do programming or anything along those lines. And so, I would say a further evolution of that has been partially within my role as CEO, and partially on some of the other initiatives I've worked on, is just recognizing that when you actually get to a point where you have certain knowledge or skills in a certain area, you can actually share that using thought leadership as a channel, and try to pass that along. And that's I wouldn't say that everything that I've done has been on the educational front. I wrote a pretty tongue-in-cheek article at the beginning of lockdown, of COVID lockdown, talking about how many bags of beans and rice you needed to stockpile to have 30 days of food. But it's very much focused on, I guess, kind of like taking the learnings from my own roots, from my upbringing, and how do we incorporate that into my modern life, if you will. It just seems like it's two different worlds, from growing up in the north and splitting wood for a wood fireplace to stay warm, to living in Vancouver, where we don't even have screens for mosquitoes on most of the windows. So it's been a major evolution for sure.
Yeah, no, that I feel that for sure. Well, so Darian, let's bring you in. I feel like you and I have something in common, although this is a leap. I feel like A, we both sit on too many boards, and B, a lot of probably what motivates me is I'm just really extroverted. People are always saying to me, how do you do all these things? And it's like, how do you not do it? Because that's how you go out and connect with people. But I'm curious, how did you end up where you are right now?
Yeah, I'll tell you a story. Going back to when my mom and dad met. So my dad came over as a refugee from Hungary. So he escaped in '56 and made it here, and met my mom, who's from Manitoba, who's Métis, and they found love and made my two older brothers and I, where we grew up in Edmonton, a place called Spruce Grove. Go Oilers. And then eventually we moved out west to where I grew up in Tsawwassen. And I think growing up, my mom actually didn't know about our Métis heritage, the culture. It wasn't until my grandpa passed away, we were quite close to, and he was amazing. We would go and stay and spend time on his farm out in Bradner. And every morning he'd make this incredible pot of porridge. And I remember him making the porridge every morning. He was just a very quiet, incredible man. And we go out on the farm and do farm stuff. It's just what you do. But he passed away. And one of my aunts, my Aunt Eileen, did a whole story about him, and kind of for the funeral, and did a PowerPoint, because that's what you do, PowerPoint. And she found these scripts and birth certificates in his history that he had kept hidden. And Josh is lovingly wearing a Métis sash on his heart there. It's so cool. You can see it. Josh is representing. And so he had this in his blood, he had it in his history, but was ashamed of it. And so I think that discovery at that funeral, and diving deeper into this world of what it means to be Métis, it's like the deep calls to deep. When certain art styles or certain music plays, or certain kind of, kind of think of it like resonance. It resonates within me. It hits a chord. And so I think I was discovering that, and then discovering there was this whole world of Indigenous support for my kids. I have 4 children, so 3, 6, just turned 8 yesterday, and 15, and the school programs taught me a lot. And so I feel like I'm still on this discovery. But then vocationally, throughout the years, worked in different vocations, and now in marketing, we developed a training arm to what we do, because we realized so many people, and whether it was people who just had all sorts of different glass ceilings, if we can get them the training and the resources and the credentials, and thankfully Google and Facebook and Hootsuite have made these incredible credentials. What does it mean to get them into the hands of people? And especially this focus has been Indigenous people in the last while. So, but yes, I love people and humans, and driven by curiosity. And I think actually I didn't think I could go to university, and it was the drive to volunteer places and apply for scholarships that got me eventually to UVic, where I spent a few years, never finished, but went there to study visual arts, actually painting and photography, and then went into child and youth care, but never did complete that degree. So again, it's an interesting common trait among us all.
Yeah, super interesting to think about. There's so many threads to follow here, but I feel like we need to get a couple elephants out of the way, because we're here to talk about Indigenous representation in tech. And I feel like there's some sort of common mythology about that I'd like us to get on the table, move it wherever it needs to go on the table, and then dive into some of these themes. So Josh, we were talking just before we started about probably number one of all the elephants in the room when one talks about Indigenous representation in tech is this idea that Indigenous communities are not connected. They lack connectivity, and therefore people from those communities will never work in tech. So can you talk a bit about what that means, how that feels for you when you hear that said?
Yeah, it's a big topic. It could probably be many series that we can talk about and probably still get no resolution. So I think the first term is educating yourself and your companies about doing your own research and finding out, about Indigenous people, to understand that it's just not one place where you can go to learn from. And it's like, okay, now I've done a 15-minute PowerPoint, or I asked this person about it. Now I know everything about Indigenous people. So that's a lot to unpack there, to just basically understand that, that we have to do that. And then secondly, it's talking about identifying what communities you're using with that statement. So although that is true, and we need to continue to work with the government and organizations to get connectivity for all, so everyone can work, the pandemic has shown that we're seeing a better diversity in our workforce with getting people connectivity, but we are seeing a lot of people that are connected that we are able to work with right now and work with them. Like from where I'm from, Prince George, I told you I'm from a place that doesn't even have, so we don't even have our own water. Everyone just has wells. They don't have a central water system, but everyone out there is connected with high-speed Wi-Fi. They have, or they have satellite, or on the drive all the way up to Fort St. James, Fort St. John, Vanderhoof, all those small places, they're all connected in there. And I think although that first narrative is true, it's also what a lot of people push back on, to say like, well, what can we do? People aren't connected, versus working with the people that do have connection right now and do that. And how we know that is because a lot of people are also, so it goes back to that other thread where a lot of people are also working in industries that almost every company now is a tech company, and they're powered. They need some sort of high-speed internet in order to do that. So if you look at even the most remote work conditions that we have, camps, they have to have some sort of connection so they can get machines online, their equipment, everything to work with. And those are, if you think about that, we can be connecting with that as our next workforce and working with them. And it goes back to the other thread about it always baffles me that we say, it almost seems daunting to retrain or retool or to educate people how to work in tech, which I feel are the next blue collar jobs of BC, and to get everyone outside of major cities to work in tech, when we can go out and we can train people with little to no experience on how to be class 1 truck drivers, or to run a feller buncher, or to run this really complicated natural resource equipment. Like, I can't believe some of my friends are able to drive an 18-wheel rig, or my little cousin just went out through the working with Métis Nation BC and got her class 1 truck driver's license. I think that's a much harder job than it is to learn how to be a web developer. Like, I sit at a desk all day, that's it. I don't have to actually drive that road from Prince George to Vancouver in an 18-wheeler and learn how to do that. So if we can do that, we can teach people how to be designers and developers and system administrators. It's just, I don't think the drive is there to actually do that.
Yeah,
but I think,
there
is a drive though. And I remember a couple of years ago, part of my kind of whatever drive, motivation to get the academy going with our scholarships was someone came to me from a large organization, association, that said, hey, we're going to want to mentor people so they can get, learn how to be better at, what they're doing in the industry. And so we know that you're Indigenous, and can you help us find Indigenous youth that we can mentor? And I was like, oh, that would be amazing. You want to mentor these Indigenous youth. That's such a great thing you want to do. It's amazing. And I was like, well, do you have any Indigenous mentors for these mentees? And they said, no, there's no Indigenous people in our industry. And this is the marketing industry. And I said, no, for real. Like, do you not know any? And they're like, no, I know no one. I don't think they exist. And so I challenged. So I went to go find them. I was like, is there anyone who's Indigenous in the marketing industry? And sure enough, it was very few. And I was like, it confirmed what they said, but I know they could have looked a little harder. They did exist out there, but I think there is that drive to say, hey, we want to help Indigenous people. We want to mentor, we want to provide support. But I think there's not enough, there's that opportunity still though to be like, hey, who are Indigenous right now? Like, who are Indigenous instructors, teachers, mentors that we can find and give them a platform, give them a space, give them a voice. Whereas it's just almost like the desire since 2015 and the drive to be like, hey, we want to be more inclusive and, DEI or whatever the acronym is you want to use. But it's almost like just taking a little step further, just a tiny little step further to say, hey, what if we also actually looked at as Indigenous people as like leaders and people of awesomeness?
Exactly.
And maybe they could actually even become managers and directors, not just kind of like charities we can give to. It's a crazy concept. I'm just throwing that out there to,
Well, you mentioned it yesterday as well, where when I said, I want to work with your program, and you said one of the first questions that you get quite a bit is, what discount do I get working with your program to hire Indigenous people? And so that narrative is out there about what sort of government programs can we get, what sort of things, and that's totally where we need to move the topic. And we actually need to move the topic to just talk about we're marketers, we're CEOs, we're engineers. Like, it shouldn't matter that, it shouldn't make it we shouldn't have to even go there, you know what I mean? To have that identifier before what we do for a living or what we do for art or what we do to create.
Yeah. And there's two great resources just in the chat. One, I read this myself as an Indigenous person, but things to know about the Indian Act, 21 Things, incredible resource. The U of A course that Dan Levy, of course, promoted. Dan Levy from Schitt's Creek, he's amazing. Used to also be the night host for MTV's after show for The Hills, if you remember Dan Levy's original TV appearances. But again, U of A has an incredible course that's free right now. So just the education side, but I think that extra drive to almost, I think that's my frustration that I come up against is more whenever I've talked to like anyone in government, like government folks or other folks, it's kind of like, oh, it's like that look of like, oh, Indigenous people, look at you. How can we help you? What do you need? It's like that little pat on the head versus like, oh, you're smart and you could be you could be my boss one day.
Or like critically, how could you help us, right? Which is a question that almost never gets asked out loud about Indigenous people. So Matthew, you've been waiting to speak. I want to.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I think, well, to the topic of connectivity, it's in some ways, I think, very similar. I agree with what Josh and Darian said. Like there's the mindset, it's also the same mindset that you're saying, talking to a branch of, you know, a certain agency or whatever in government and getting kind of that pat on the head kind of a feeling, being talked down to sometimes. And then also, you know, within the training, a lot of the training programs, it's still, you can see that same mindset in just the type of training, like what's the highest level training that you can get to with some of these programs. And then with the connectivity, you know, again, it's kind of the same thing. When I look at training programs, they're often, you know, often in a periphery to like natural resource extraction or like, you know, very major industry or, you know, in the training side or in the connectivity side, you know, like it's kind of like a major telco narrative almost. And you see these like large Canadian corporations that are maybe affiliated with it, but they're not actually kind of engaging in the community or like what's needed from the ground up. Because the connectivity conversation around, oh, well, we don't have enough people connected. Yes, that's one problem. But, you know, the people that are connected, one, do they have, you know, the perfect example of, do they have leaders that they can look to and be like, hey, you know, my brother's a software developer. He taught himself and now he's working remotely here from, you know, from where we live. He's working for Google, you know, and this is completely attainable, but not if you believe it's not, and if you have this glass ceiling around there. And so I think there's a huge opportunity to actually take what's already available and start working with that to you know, that'll just increase the needle or move the needle and increase the ability to say, okay, well, we have so many people here now that, you know, maybe live on this reserve, and these couple of people who live here, they work in these tech industries. Maybe this one person started a company and, you know, hired a couple other people from the reserve. Now there's a tech startup there, and as that starts to build, connectivity is just almost a byproduct. You know, and as that expands, and the other thing I would say is sometimes we look at these problems purely from you know, how do I get this ISP's fiber optic cable past all of these different, you know, remote locations, when maybe we need to take the ISP out of the conversation entirely and say, hey, actually, there's all the technology available for much less money to establish new forms of internet or new forms of connectivity that aren't necessarily on the rails of traditional ISPs.
All right, well, so Matthew has solved the connectivity problem in rural and remote. And I do want to emphasize the point that Josh was making. So to put some fine numbers on it, there's over 250,000 Indigenous people in British Columbia. Only about 40,000 of those are in rural and remote communities. So what are your strategies for hiring the 230,000 or some percentage of those that have great connectivity, live in the Lower Mainland, they live in Kelowna, they live on the South Island, they live in all sorts of places. And so let's drill down a bit on that. And I think, Darian, I'd like to follow up on a point you made and then a point Matthew made. So when I was growing up, my father was also, I did not find out until my mid-20s that he was Indigenous, and I was told that Dad tanned well. That was the explanation for what was going on in our family. And I'm curious about this thing around, like, maybe there's lots of us here already in tech. It's just that we've made ourselves invisible because it's not accepted that we're here. I mean, we know this happens with women, where there's women coming into tech and then they leave tech because they don't feel that it's a comfortable space for them. So how do you make it an environment where Indigenous people feel comfortable identifying themselves as Indigenous?
I think part of that comment I was given a couple of years ago, I think I've been trying to find those Indigenous people in kind of marketing tech. And so found a good group of them, and kind of been trying to give them voice and a platform any way I can, whether it's through a podcast or through a website or through editorial. And then our school, we've been training up and developing Indigenous people as instructors. I think one of the saddest, most exciting parts about when students graduate from our school is these Indigenous people are saying, it was the first time I ever saw a teacher that was Indigenous. Like I've gone through these other programs and they say things like I could do that. And to give them those Northern Stars and to give them people who look like them, talk like them, have understanding, I think is so, so key, because I think it's so easy. We kind of see this habit of the government will give money to another outside organization that's, white led, white run, and be like, oh, they'll take care of the Indigenous people because we trust them. But it's like, imagine the day when the government's like, hey, what if we gave the money to Indigenous people to lead other Indigenous people and inspire and teach other Indigenous people, led by Indigenous people? And I think we're almost there. Like, I feel like we're on that edge, and it may happen. And that's part of that gives me some hope and excitement of, I feel like people are open to the concept now. And I think we're trying to lead in it and do it right now. But it's taken some time, but we also live in a very generous place too. Like, Best Buy heard of what we were doing and said, any Indigenous person who doesn't have a high quality enough cell phone or laptop, we're going to ship them a brand new one. No questions asked. So Best Buy shipped over 60 laptops and cell phones to Indigenous people right across Canada. And these stories of this person who got a job, in Toronto, they got to live in community in Northern Alberta. And when they got the job, they actually sent them a new laptop, and they got to give their laptop donated by Best Buy back to someone who lived in community with them. So they then said, you could get a job. Like, look what job I just got. I get to live at home. They pay me this great salary, great benefits. I got a cool hoodie too. Or was it Bunny Hug? Bunny Snugger? Yeah, there you go. And it's great because tech loves giving out bunny hugs. And you could do it too and pass down that laptop. I imagine actually it was kind of fun. I was thinking of like the lightsaber being passed down, right? Like, because in a laptop, it's powerful what you can do at the helm of a laptop. And to pass a lightsaber down after you've been given a new lightsaber, and to pass it down to a young Padawan to say, like, you too could be a Jedi Master and take over the world and get paid well and work from home and get a free hoodie. It's awesome.
I knew it was only going to be so long before. Well, I was thinking Baby Yoda was how egg was going to get cracked. But Josh, I feel like I need to get you in here to explain bunny hugger, or people will leave here wondering why we never explained what that meant.
I think that's a whole other tech talk where we bring in colleagues from anyone here that's from Saskatchewan and Alberta will understand, and we can sync up afterwards to talk about bunny hug versus hoodie.
Perfect. Okay, so Matthew, the sort of twin of erasure, maybe it's the cousin of erasure. So when we're erasing ourselves and our indigeneity, because it seems easier to do that, is imposter syndrome. So when you're talking about MIT, I didn't go to university, barely made it through high school, had a long and fulfilling career journey. And when I left City Council, it's a very long story, but the short story is I got convinced to apply to a fellowship at Harvard. Not because I thought I was going to get in. I wanted a job from someone, and they were like, oh, well, sure, but you should really apply for this fellowship because that will do what you want to do in this job. So I applied. And then I got in, and I made it. You don't apply to Harvard, get in, and to a fellowship, a paid opportunity to go to Harvard, and say no. So I flew all the way to Boston for the orientation, made it on the subway to the stop that said Harvard, got off on the platform and froze and thought I cannot do this. Had to actually pick up a lifeline and call a friend and have them walk me up the stairs on the phone together, because it just seemed impossible that me and Harvard were going to be in the same sentence together. So how do you, what can people do to help? I mean, we have to, it's within ourselves, but how do you create a culture where we don't feel like imposters, we don't feel like we don't belong?
Yeah, there's, it's, you mentioned a little bit of your own story and the erasure aspect, I think, is a big part of it. Not getting into too many details, but in my own journey, I was in my 30s before I found out. Kind of had always suspected. We both have Mennonite last names, so I grew up in a very white community, and I was the kid that tanned super well, and it was just kind of oh, well, that's, that, Matt just, worked better outside, doesn't affected by the sun as much, but it wasn't until after I actually met my father, I, learned about this incredibly rich history that had always been kind of an open question mark for me. And that was kind of there's a huge amount of learning through that. But one of the things that I had kind of identified was that, there had been a lot of things, like I said, I thought most likely, you know, a couple of Indigenous friends that I had, you know, there was some commonalities in our skin tone or things along those lines. And, you know, one of the things that I kind of realized once I knew that I was Indigenous was that I'd kind of experienced, even in a very warm community, there was like some, what I would almost call like more passive racism comments like, oh, you know, you're, you know, the manager of the care home where my grandmother was at, you know, would be like, oh, well, you know, look at my my brother and be like, oh, I see how the relation here, but you don't look like you fit into this family. And it just flat out say that. And my grandma would just like tell him off because she loved and accepted all of us. But it kind of made me realize like, wow, this is, you know, this is actually something I hadn't really noticed how pervasive it had been throughout my life. And I think that some of those things, some of those aspects, whether it's Indigenous or whether it's growing up in a poor community or poor family, or we end up with these, you know, in some cases they're self-imposed, in some cases society tells us, but they're, you know, like this is as far as you can go. And so it's interesting you're talking about, you know, applying for Harvard, and that was kind of the same thing with MIT. I was like, well, I have this opportunity. I'm being asked to apply. I'm just going to do it. And, you know, at least I'll say I'll have done it. And then I came home one day and saw an acceptance letter and I was like, oh my God. And that's when almost the panic kind of hit in, is like, now, you know, the first sessions, being on, you know, engaging with my cohort and just waiting for somebody to, you know, discover that I actually didn't have the, you know, the credentials or the experience that they did. I was super fortunate in that as we did some of our first work and submitted some of our first work, when we went to get the results back, there was a glitch in the exam reporting system. So instead of just seeing my results, I got to see how I plotted on the curve. And that was incredibly helpful because I'd actually done really well on a topic that I actually knew really well, but didn't give myself credit for. And it kind of made me realize the gap between my own, like where I was limiting myself a little bit versus like where I was actually grading, and being like, you know what, I'm just going to operate from this perspective and say like, I'm pretty sure I know this. And if anybody wants to like challenge me and say that I'm wrong, I'm happy to learn further and deeper in that, you know. But a lot of that stuff I think was, you know, just challenges that, whether they had been part of my environment, been told to me explicitly, or I'd somehow developed them on my own, they were, you know, challenges that I'd, you know, was really holding on to for myself.
Yeah. Josh, I'm going to bring you in here. So we've talked about connectivity and how to deal with that barrier or lack of barrier. We've talked about, I mean, I'll say retention, but I think it's this question of culture. Like, does the internal culture receive you as an Indigenous person in a way that you want to be in the world or not? I saw some of the women, and particularly the women of color, nodding vigorously. So this isn't just an Indigenous issue in tech, right? It's an issue about a center of gravity in tech that leaves a lot of people out. But the one we haven't talked about, we touched on it in the beginning, but in a more deep way, to talk about access to education. So Josh, I'd love to hear your thoughts, or to have you kick us off on what is needed if jobs are going out there and being posted and they say you need a master's degree. Oh, and they'd also love Indigenous people to apply. It's not that Indigenous people don't have master's degrees, but for the reasons we've all talked about, a lot of us don't. So what needs to change in order to make those barriers? Is it increasing the access to the education, or is it changing the way tech orients to the needed education, or something else in between that?
Yeah, I've been talking about this the last 2 or 3 weeks so much. I'm kind of a bit scrambled because I don't even know which rant to hit on here. I think it's a responsibility of our companies, first and foremost, to make sure that you have a clear diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy, which I think most do. But if you want to focus on hiring Indigenous people, you have to focus on that. You have to have some clear focus. And then, you know, one of the things we don't talk about as much in tech, and I'll talk about the good part about tech and my journey in a second, but one of the things we don't focus on is we kind of build all of these job postings based on I don't know what the concept's called. I call it stumbling forward, where we have, you could kind of stumble forward if you're, my other rant is education and the cost of education in this country is for the well-off rich people, and it's a way to systematically it's a systematically colonization sort of thing that we can make sure only people that have money are able to get education and be able to get jobs and be able to apply for those. So we see people that's not a barrier to have the confidence to be able to apply for those positions, negotiate high salaries and be able to get them. And then so your responsibility as a company is to make sure that you have positions that work experience can also be a factor in there as well. And why that's important is because that's been my entire journey on thinking and being told by the school system that the only way that I'll ever get a high paying job is there's two options. One of them, well, there's three options. One of them is you'll get something through your family and you'll work for your family company and you'll be fine. The other one is you'll get a well-paid job. Hopefully that's in usually natural resources or the railroad. So you have to be able to get in there, and that's really hard to get in. And third is you have to have an education. And there's not really a fourth option in there. But the option that I found was being able to work those jobs and network and be able to start doing the jobs that you can afford to do in university and learning on the job. That's a really good option. So for education, I think we also have to work as companies by not only just recruiting from the universities, which I think are fantastic. And when I say this, it's not one or the other. It's not like, oh, don't hire from universities. We absolutely need the universities in the ecosystem. But what I'm saying is, for the majority of British Columbians that live outside of cities, they're not an option. And we have to work with the BCITs, work with the local colleges, community colleges, to have training to be able to go in and to do this. And what I'll say about tech is there's lots of problems with tech. There's lots of problems with every industry. But in tech over the last 10 years, I can't imagine another, like I worked in hospitality. I worked in tech for 20 years and I worked in hospitality since I was 15, and how fast I could move up and with tech, or the access and the tools we have right now with a laptop and Twitter and LinkedIn and all these other resources. You actually have the tools to reach out to people and ask them questions and probably get feedback back, which is unlike any other time in history. So you can really leverage that to move up. And if that doesn't work, you could create your own verticals, and you can be from home and you could create the next Wordle. And that's just could be one person or it could be two people, and you could do that yourself. And very few other industries you can do that. So I think we really need to leverage that and look at expanding our notion of businesses, of where we hire from and how we're a champion. And if you're not speaking at those other universities or at those beyond universities, if you're not speaking at community colleges and in the places where you want to hire at, expect little to no results, because you're not there putting in the effort. Because I know, being from up north, people say a lot of things, and we see emails or we hear people saying we're listening. If they're not in my town talking, we're just like, who is this person? Like, I don't relate to them at all. Like, you don't live here, you don't know what's going on. So I think that's what we have to do as businesses.
Yeah.
I want to give a quick just shout out to Npower and Inspire, who are finding Indigenous people, whether they're in high school or between high school and university, or just trying to find a job out there. And those are two amazing organizations. If you're on this call and you're like, well, what do I do? What now? Josh has made me feel so convicted. And Matthew, I'm so inspired. Look at him. What do I do? The two amazing organizations. Send them $20, send them $20.22. It's 2022. But Inspire, Npower, incredible organizations. I know Pamela's on here now with Microsoft. They are big fans and supporters of Npower. But yeah, two great ones that you can practically support. Matthew.
That's really cool. I think, yeah, just I wanted to riff a bit of what Josh was saying is that, from a company perspective, and, for hiring Indigenous, like we have looked at, what sort of, where do we, where can you find talent as something you brought up earlier, Darian, or like, trying to find what we've found a lot of times is that the programs that are doing training, it's maybe they might go as high as intro to web dev as an example, but they are usually, if they're in the technical side at all, and I know there's quite a few different organizations, but on a company side, while we would love to find more Indigenous people, and we definitely don't we don't necessarily have the access or to the talent pool. It has to be, from a company perspective, I think it has to just be, it's kind of like a mandate. And we had this, we started out focusing a lot on the blockchain space, which is like a 19 guys to one girl type of industry, especially back in the time. And we said, we actually want to really focus on having an inclusive workplace. And so that required HR policies that said, we're not going to go on either side beyond a 40-60 split. And we've actually been able to maintain that and make sure that, and it's amazing how much it helps in the dynamics of the team as well. But when you look at, from the corporate side, it has to come kind of as a top down, where it's not just like, you have to change your approach. Like, do you actually need somebody who has a master's in comp sci, or do you need somebody who can pass a code test and demonstrate that they can think creatively within a programming language? That's actually all you need to know. And so changing your hiring processes to look more at, is this person, code tests are a fantastic tool for this in our application, because if we're looking for a developer, we can see how they're thinking in developing this code and be like, yes, this person is actually problem solving. They have a good grasp of this. This is going to be a good resource for what we need. And it matters so much less about where they're from, what degree they have, any of those types of elements. Also with COVID, fully remote work has been helpful as well. But I would also say that in a lot of the organizations that are working on some of these problems, when I look at, let's say, like a program like a web dev program, like there's one organization that focuses on tech in First Nations communities and development of technology. But when you look at the programs, and often it's their hands are kind of tied based on the prescriptions of government funding, let's say. And you asked Andrea about the 230,000 that live in cities in BC. Well, most of those people can't actually go get that intro to web dev course. They're not allowed because they're not in a rural area. And so, if you're not in a rural area or in a community, if you're not, within certain buckets, you all of a sudden get cut out. And I think there's actually a ton of that, the 40,000 as a percentage compared to a percentage of the 230,000 that are in cities. I think those ones in cities are much more likely to go take some digital marketing courses, take some web development courses, because they have examples that they can look to locally already, and they have a larger community to draw from. And I think that is something that we can probably do better at, is like look at shifting some of this. It's not so much about like an Indigenous person has to live on a reserve. That's like and growing up in Winnipeg, well, technically we didn't move, just the city grew around, and so it's to say, well, oh, you're in an urban center, so now you don't qualify for this support. It kind of shoots the whole program, the whole goal of what we're trying to accomplish, takes it out of the needs in a lot of ways, and takes away the opportunity for those people in a community, in an urban center, to become leaders. That somebody who's young and looking at trying to figure out what they're going to do after school, or maybe they're just done with school and they want to figure out what they want to do, they might find that, if they can look and see an example of, oh, there's somebody who's, like me, had a similar journey, and he went on and, got a job working for this company, learned some basic skills, went on and took a digital marketing course, became a, marketing coordinator. Next thing you know, they're CMO of a startup that does really well. These are journeys that, that happen all the time. But these are the type of stories and examples that I think would have been really beneficial to me, when I was like 15 years old. And I was like, okay, well, what can I do? I can become a welder. I can keep working on the farm. I can, like it was just the options were limited. The idea of working in tech or in finance or in any of these unattainable industries was just like, it wasn't even a concept I had no realization in that area.
Yeah, no, that was when I was growing up. You worked in forestry, you worked at hydro, or you left town. Those were your options. I mean, maybe the ferries if you lived in coastal, like that close to one, but otherwise that was it. So we've got a few minutes left. The last question I'm going to ask you all is, what is the next step? So someone leaves this webinar. I mean, presumably they've got lunch or another meeting or something, but it's sometime in the next 24 hours. If they're called to action, what is the next step they can take? And while you're thinking about that, I'm just going to give a bit of a summary of what we've talked about at a broad level. So we've talked about, Darian has some great resources about educating yourself, like sort of demythologizing Indigenous people. We live in cities. The single largest language speakers of Indigenous languages in Vancouver are Cree people from the prairies. There's more Haida and Nisga'a living in Vancouver than there are in either of their territories for economic reasons and other reasons. But to understand it, it's not all about reserves somewhere out there. To have an EDI policy, equity, diversity, and inclusion policy, to find the people that are there and make them visible and make them feel comfortable about being visible in your organizations, and then to action all these principles. So you've heard the stories we've shared today, but so what does that mean for your hiring policies and how you're posting jobs, and to really think about that? And Matthew, I might start with you on the call to action, partly because I'm dying to ask you, so how did you do that? You changed your policies, but like how did that actually functionally work? What were the first steps you took to do that?
Well, it was within our own company for our policies was to say like, okay, well, we can see this as a problem in the industry. We don't want to have to deal with those same symptoms and issues. So sitting down as a management team and agreeing that, it's really hard to say we're going to walk 50-50 gender, gender hiring policy 50-50 all the time. There's going to be sprints of hiring where you're going to have ups and downs. So that's why we had that flex of 40 to 60 on either side, but maintain a balance was really the goal. So it's not like hard line, but we've definitely seen scenarios where in hiring situations where we're looking and we're like, well, normally we would what it has changed in our and I don't like we have somebody who leads our hiring specifically, but what it's really changed in the process is there's sometimes when we need to staff up as we're scaling up for a tech company, and you're like, okay, well, here's an intermediate person that's kind of okay, and maybe we're in this case, this person, we've had a bunch of applicants, we don't have any female applicants that have come into the pool. What we've looked at that is that there's nobody there that's like in that pool that's like a stellar perfect match, and we kept it open rather than normally we might say, okay, well, we're going to try working with one of these and maybe get them trained up, etc. And rather said, like, we're going to wait for a perfect, a much more perfect fit or somebody that better fits what we need as our values. And that was one of the things. So it has to weigh into the decision making. And the cool thing is that as we just left that space open, the next thing you know, we get an introduction to somebody who turns out to be a great fit. We have certain roles where somebody has come in one role, and then just like they're like, okay, this person's really good for this, we're going to bring them in. We waited to find a good fit, and then now that person is now hiring and tapping into their own pools and actually making it easier to access more people like them as well. So that has been part of it. And I would say, from a next step for any companies that are looking at doing this, it's not actually nearly as hard as we thought it would, especially when you're opening up to all but Canada or all but Quebec workforce, a type of a hiring opportunity. That makes it a lot easier as well. And then from organizations that are involved in the training or in the funding and stuff like that, I think we really need to go back to the drawing board on some of this and really look at like, what is, these jobs that Josh was talking about in this community, like what is that job? And there's like a bit of a gap between like where the learning can get you today, like, hey, this is how to turn on a computer and access 6 system functions. This is a learning deliverable. How do we get the person to the point where they're actually an intermediate developer, or they're, they can be a, a social media or marketing manager, or, some of these more like mid-level skilling people up to that, rather than just getting people to, hey, we gave everyone like this how to turn on a computer and connect to the internet as the only learning deliverables. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe somebody else has some other ideas.
I can ask Josh, and then we'll go to Darian before we close it out.
Yeah, I'd just say like start with the basics. If this is important to your organization and it's something you want to work on, you need to have the education to make sure that you have an environment that feels welcoming. And I think a lot of things we do in business, and I mentioned before, it's not, I mean, how we run business, how we work in offices, how we do this isn't very, it doesn't flow very well towards sometimes the language you use or the communication we have. I mean, take the course from BCIT that Corey Wilson does on Indigenous 101. I think sometimes it's presented through different organizations. You can do that. Get the course through Métis Nation, British Columbia, to come in, get somebody to talk to you. You can do all these things right now. I know everyone facilitates lunch and learns to talk about it. Start with the basics. You should be doing something on holidays that are important to Indigenous people if you're also celebrating Canada Day. So what are you doing as an organization? How are your leaders communicating that? How are you making a welcoming environment or a place where people can be themselves? And then also it goes back to that whole, something else identifier that we saw during the US elections, where it said something else, because sometimes people don't want to identify either, and I think we should be respectful about that it doesn't have that. So I think it starts with education. You have to educate yourself, and you have to make sure that you're not going to people to learn about everything from a person. You should be learning yourself as leaders of your organization and resources for your organization to learn.
Perfect. And Darian, you want to close us out?
Well, I want to echo the words of Jill Tipping, who talked about the Digital Lift program. So right here in BC, Digital Lift is seeking out and finding Indigenous people, women, kind of underserved communities, and getting them into tech. They're doing the rapid reskilling. And I love that term. I love the term micro-credentials. I love the term, it's kind of giving them those tickets. I think Josh said it so well, and I've been chewing on it since I heard him say it, where it's like, what does it mean to actually give people the credentials and the tickets, which gives them, like Matthew said, that sense of confidence to say, hey, I've been ticketed. I've been given an outside organization verifying it, that what I know is what I know. And Josh uses Digital Lift. It's incredible. Brian Roberts, I don't think he's on here, but we worked with him and he was amazing. They find these people. And then, so if you're looking to hire people, and you want to say, well, I'm going to hire them, but I don't want to hire them for the sake of just hiring them. And I don't want to hire them just because I'm going to get some grant thingy. I want to hire them at a real salary with real benefits. Go to Digital Lift, because they're going to be credentialed. They're going to have certificates to their name. And if they don't, maybe you can help them get them as part of your program, but pay them a full salary, get them in there. Because then ideally, my dream is in 3 years, there's no such thing as Indigenous consultants who have to go into laws. Like I got recently asked, go and help us understand what is the difference between Inuit, Indigenous people, and Métis. What are First Nations, and can we use the term Indian anymore? Can we call you an Indian? So but imagine if instead of hiring an outside person, they just said, hey, the guy down the desk at the desk next to me is Indigenous, or the person at the water cooler is Indigenous, or the person on my Slack channel, and because of Digital Lift, that's 100% possible in 3 years. And I know Erica's working on it. Brian's working on it. Erica even encouraged me and said, you should become a Digital Lift sponsor and give money towards this. She sent this really great email about that. If you want to feel encouraged to do that, email Erica and she'll send you a really classy email about joining the club. And it's a cool club, right, Erica? Like we'll get a jacket or something, a hoodie.
Bunny hugs.
Bunny hugs. You get a bunny hug to be part of the Digital Lift Cool Kids Club. But I just think that's what's so neat, is that they are genuinely working to flip the script and have Indigenous people as coworkers and managers and bosses and leaders. And that's the dream. So.